Now that we've discussed the 5 factors involved in changing the rate of nucleophilic alkyl substitution reactions, SN1 and SN2, and elimination reactions E1 and E2, we need to devote our attention to finding out what reaction will occur given an individual situation. The best way to do that will be to briefly walk through general analytic examples to determine which of those 4 pathways is going to dominate in an individual situation. While you can look at the 5 factors in any order, I think it will be most productive in most cases to look at them in the order in which I introduced them, which is first the leader group, then the substrate structure, then the nucleophile, then the solvent effect, and finally any steric effects that have not been captured in the previous 4. Why look at the leader group first? Because if there is no leader group, then there is no reaction, and you don't need to look at the other 4. So step 1 should always be to identify the leader group. And then in practice, if you don't have one of the halogens that is not fluorine, that is chloride, bromide, and iodide, or a sulfonic acid derivative, then there is no reaction. By which I mean there is neither a nucleophilic alkyl substitution or an elimination reaction. Other types of reactions may be possible, but we haven't covered those yet, so you don't need to worry. So chloride, bromide, iodide, or a sulfonate ion. And those sulfonate ions, the common ones that we introduced, were mesylate, tosylate, and triflate. Other sulfonic acid derivatives can be used, but they will all share this characteristic of having a sulfur doubly bonded to 2 oxygens with the oxygen attached to your alkyl group and something attached, some alkyl group or allyl attached. It's important when you're thinking about these reactions to note that you never break the carbon-sulfur bond and you never break the sulfur-oxygen bond. The bond that's going to be broken is always the bond between the oxygen and the carbon. Right? Oxygen and carbon bond breaks to generate the sulfonate ion, and you leave these alone. It's common to make the mistake of breaking the bond between the sulfur and the carbon and having a reaction occur at the methyl group of the sulfonate ion, but that's never the right answer. Right? It's always the carbon-oxygen bond that breaks. So you're going to look for the presence of one of these 6 things. If it's present, then you proceed to the next step. If it's not, then you write down no reaction and you move on. The second thing, step 2, to be consistent here, step 2 is to look at the substrate structure and determine if the substrate structure can tell you something, can allow you to eliminate some possibilities. If it's a methyl substrate, then you can immediately rule out either elimination pathway. Because if the substrate is methyl, there is no beta hydrogen. And the elimination pathways both involve the removal of the beta hydrogen. If the substrate is primary, you can rule out unimolecular pathways. So the SN1 and E1 pathways can be eliminated. You can also rule out unimolecular pathways if the substrate is methyl. So SN1 can also be ruled out in this situation. Because the carbocation is too unstable. Primary carbocations and methyl carbocations are not stable enough to allow the leaving group to leave spontaneously to form that carbocation base. And then we only have to worry about whether it's a substitution reaction or an elimination reaction. If it's tertiary, we can rule out the SN2 pathway. The SN2 is a tertiary substrate, that it won't be able to compete with the others. We can't rule out the E2 pathway, though. If it's primary, we can rule out both substitution and elimination in the unimolecular pathways. But if it's tertiary, we can only rule out the SF2 pathway because E2 elimination is not as subject to steric hindrance as the E1 or the SN2 pathway, because the reaction is happening further away from that substitution. If it's secondary, we can't rule anything out. All four pathways are still possible. So if it's secondary, we're going to move on and need to look at something else. But for any of those, if there isn't a leaving group, there's still no reaction. Step 3 is to look at the nucleophile and determine how good it is. And how good the Bronsted-Lowry base. Things that are very good Bronsted-Lowry bases are going to tend to enhance the elimination pathways, either E1 or E2. And the excellent Bronsted-Lowry bases, the very strong ones, especially if they're also hindered, are going to tend to favor the E2 pathway. So, the elimination if it's a strong Bronsted-Lowry base, and that in practice means oxygen anions that are not resonance stabilized and that in practice means hydroxide ion and alkoxide ions and nitrogen anions like NH2 minus or NR2. An example being the diisopropyl amide, which is one of your strong hindered bases that tends to always go E2. So if you have a strong broad section, and whether or not it's E1 or E2 is going to depend a little bit on the substrate structure. If your nucleophile is weak, like neutral oxygen, for instance, water, or in alcohols, ethanol, ethanol. you're typically going to see unimolecular reaction. And the SN1 pathway will usually dominate. That's a sylvolysis reaction. These are not good bases, so they're not likely to want to remove a proton, but they are good enough nucleophiles to react with the carbocation intermediate. So the SN1 pathway will usually dominate. If your nucleophile is strong, but not very basic in a Bronsted-Lowry sense, things like acetate ion, azide ion, cyanide ion. Right? These are good nucleophiles. They're not very basic. And then also chloride and bromide and iodide, which are very weak bases. Probably you're going to get primarily the SN2 reaction. The exception being, of course, if you have a hard base like cyanide or azide or fluoride, for example, that's in a protic solvent. Right? If you have a heavily solvated anions, then you're likely to not get an SO2 reaction. In the absence of some other compelling factor, we will assume that heavily solvated anions will produce SN1 pathways. Step 4, we're going to look at the solvent. Water or alcohol. Often SN1 and E1 will dominate. With the important exception of the alkoxide bases. Run in ethanol as the solvent. If sodium methoxide is the base, the solvent is ethanol. If sodium methoxide is the base, then the solvent is methanol. And anytime you see a alkoxide base like that, you're doing an elimination pathway, not a substitution pathway, and generally an E2 elimination. Regardless of the solvent. As I said, ethoxide ion is usually used in ethanol solvent for the simple reason that you often create ethoxide ion by adding, or sodium methoxide by adding sodium methyl to methanol, and it reacts to form hydrogen gas with the corresponding alkoxide. So it's convenient to use the alcohol, corresponding alcohol as the solvent. So that's an important exception where the protic solvent will actually undergo a bimolecular pathway, the E2 elimination pathway, because of the strongly basic nature of these nucleophiles. For something like fluoride or azide or even acetate in a protic solvent, you're going to tend to do an SN1 pathway instead of the SN2 pathway. Conversely, if you see a polar aprotic solvent, then the reaction is likely the SN2 pathway. fewer exceptions to that rule for the unimolecular pathway. And then the last thing we would want to look at is sterics. You will already have considered steric hindrance at the alpha position in step 2 when you were looking at substrate structure and determining that a primary substrate would not be able to do a unimolecular pathway because of the instability of carbocation, and a tertiary substrate would not be able to do an SN2 reaction because of the steric hindrance of accessing that carbon in a tertiary substrate. But now would be a good time to look and think if you have branching in the beta position. If you have branching in the beta position, then we to see an SN1 pathway taking over, even if the nucleophile is good enough to do an SN2 pathway, as it would be in these cases. And if you have a sterically hindered nucleophile, the SN1 pathway is unaffected by that, but the SN2 pathway is reduced. Usually, you already have where you get to looking at. But if you have a secondary substrate with a good nucleophile like acetate, and your solvent is a nonpolar solvent, which really doesn't tell you anything one way or the other, then steric hindrance in the beta position might be the deciding factor that would tell you that the SN1 pathway is the dominant pathway instead of the SN2 pathway. In the next video, we'll go through a series of examples and look at these things step by step to determine which pathway